In St. Paul, spring has sprung. From my spot at this Como Avenue red light, there's another sign of the changing seasons. The bicycle paths on either side of me are swarming with cyclists. As I kept heading west, I decided the weather merited a walk in the sun. I pulled off to park the car and started to stroll around Como Lake. I left the road behind, but the bike path stuck close to the sidewalk. As the cyclist wheeled past, it got me thinking, where did all these bike lanes, bike paths, greenways, and amenities like bike racks come from? When and why did Minnesotans embrace bicycling? As I started looking into these questions, it became clear that there is no simple answer. Location matters to how people have experienced biking, and people use bicycles and cycling infrastructure in different ways for different purposes. Keeping these things in mind, I spoke with two people who share a love of cycling, but who live in different places. Peggy Prowe has been living in Northfield, a town outside of the Twin Cities, since the 1960s.
I grew up in Kansas and bicycled with my mother and family, a string of 4 children, and we went out for picnics, and it was a wonderful way to get around without getting in the car. I came to Minnesota to the Boundary Waters, and they convinced me that this was the place to live, and I taught physical education, mainly aquatics, at Carleton College for 26 years. It was a great way to interact with the community of Northfield, and eventually I became a city councilwoman and spent 10 years in that position.
And José Luis Villaseñor, founder of Tamales y Bicicletas, who lives in Minneapolis.
My name is José Luis Villaseñor, he, him, his. I am first-generation Mexicano. My family's originally from the state of Michoacán. Grew up in Alaska and have been living here for a long time in Minnesota. And I do a lot of work around environmental justice, food justice, but if anything, just pushing back on systems that continue to exploit and or ignore our perspectives as immigrant, indigenous people of color.
I also spoke with historian and bicycle planner Peter Bird.
My name is Peter Bird. My background before being in the position that I'm in right now is actually urban planning, transportation planning, specifically working as a bicycle planner. For the last about 3 years, I've been working with the university I'm with right now, the Eindhoven University of Technology in the Netherlands. And so working with some people who are historians, specifically historians of technology and of innovation, and then working with other more traditional mobility scholars who are focusing on policy, on a lot of the things that cities and that locales are facing today. And so the project that I work on is with a group called Cycling Cities. It's historical in nature, but tries to understand kind of why it is that some cities globally have developed as what we call true cycling cities, while others haven't.
In order to understand why Minnesotans have a strong biking culture, I needed to dive into the past and figure out when bicycling first became popular in Minnesota. For that, I spoke with Peter Bird.
I would say that in the 1880s, that's when the bicycle really starts to become a technology that people, on one hand, it's safe enough that they can use it for actual mobility, and then on another hand, its production is actually affordable, that it's not just something for the upper class, but kind of a middle upper class user, which is what the Victorian cycling is.
In the 1870s and 1880s, the popular bicycle style was one called the high wheeler, also known as the penny farthing. The high wheeler had 2 different sized wheels, a large one up front to help with speed, and a smaller one in the back. The tires were made of wood in the early days, then solid rubber once that material was more available in the 1880s. These tires made for a bumpier ride. Cyclists would perch in the front. It was a somewhat top-heavy arrangement. Headfirst falls over the handlebars were a real hazard. Cycling's increase in popularity in the 1880s was partially due to a new technology, the safety bicycle. This looked more like the bikes we're familiar with today. It had 2 wheels of equal size, but could reach similar speeds to the high-wheeler thanks to its gear and chain technology. Perhaps the biggest improvement came in 1892 with the introduction of pneumatic tires, aka hollow rubber tires with air inside. These technological developments not only meant safety bikes were a more comfortable ride, but far less accident-prone due to the same-sized wheels. I've only seen the pictures of the penny farthing bikes in any way, shape, or form, and I always sort of wondered, how are they staying on there? How do they get on there?
Yeah.
Those kinds of questions.
I think there are a lot of crashes on those.
Yes, I can only imagine, and I can see why, the modern safety bicycle with 2 wheels that are the same size, that seemingly is easier for both women and men and children to get on, right? And presumably just easier to keep your balance, I would imagine.
Yeah, definitely easier to balance on. And what always strikes me is that technological change, that what came out of it is very, very similar to the bicycles we ride today. That we've made them, more efficient with gearing and aerodynamics and things, but it's essentially the same machine compared to when you go backwards in history from the, that period, 1890 or so. And the bicycles look like very different types of tools. But the transition from the high-wheel bicycle to the safety bicycle is really the technological one that makes the bicycle a mobility tool instead of a toy.
Safety bikes really took off in the 1890s. In the 1880s, a safety bicycle and a high-wheeler cost roughly the same, $100 to $150, or about 5 months' wages for the average person. By 1898, Twin Cities bike shops sold the safety bike for about $30, making it a fairly accessible means of mobility, broadening the population of cyclists.
I would say that kind of towards the end of the 1890s, as the demographics who are biking start to broaden, that you see maybe not a different technologies necessarily, but different use of the technology. So as it's not solely these kind of young, adventurous, wealthy men who have bicycles, which is the case pretty early on as it transitions to, like you mentioned earlier, women biking, which is one of the big stories out of the Victorian era of the freedom that it offered women. Children biking, it's still very kind of upper class at that point, but the demographic gets wider.
Bicycles gave women a new freedom of movement, the ability to travel around the city chaperone-free. They could now meet and organize, especially for political reasons, like the women's suffrage movement. On top of this, bicycles contributed to the women's clothing revolution. The clothing required to safely ride a bike was a far cry from the long skirts women of the time were wearing. So women began wearing bloomers, loose-fitting pants that resembled men's pants in public, and not only when they were riding bicycles. The popularity of bicycles meant there must have been a good bit of demand. It made me wonder about where people went to buy bicycles and who was making them. Turns out, one of the most important materials for producing the safety bicycle was the natural rubber. Between the popularity of cycling and the growing automobile industry, demand for it skyrocketed.
It's also important to note that the rubber that was available to produce those tires like that came out of a lot of exploitation in what then was the Belgian Congo. And so a lot of times, sort of the global trade that existed enabled these new technologies to be changed and to be more available. But in a lot of ways, the people who used them really had no idea kind of what the cost was of some of that technological development.
Companies operating in West and West Central Africa forced local people to tap wild or natural rubber under the threat of imprisonment, violence, and even death. These horrific conditions eventually became global news in the first decade of the 1900s. This news, among other things, helped to shift the market away from natural rubber to synthetic rubber. By the 1920s and 1930s, it was being used to make pneumatic bicycle tires. All of this brought me back to my original question. Who was producing these bicycles? Because of the rubber, it made me think about supply chains, right? And so if people want a bike, could they just walk into a bike shop and they had what they needed, or did they have to kind of place an order, or where is it coming from?
Yeah.
Do you have a sense for that at all in your research?
I can say that, especially in the 1890s, that a very strong and robust bicycle industry develops across the country and really across the world. But the U.S. American manufacturers are really where they are able to push that from an invention into something that can be mass produced. And so in research we've done I have colleagues who've done research in Johannesburg, and you see bike shops advertising American-made bicycles in the 1890s in shops in Johannesburg, that there's this global transfer not only of technology, but of products as well. And so a whole global network chain of bicycles, that it's an industry that develops then.
Could you tell me, in kind of some of the research that you've been doing on Minneapolis for that early period, 1890s in particular, what were the kind of maybe businesses that supported bicycles in that time?
So I think a good starting point for it is understanding what technologies and mobility were available at the time, which was not very much. There was essentially walking in the city. You had long-distance trains, and then really at the same time, you have streetcars becoming electrified and starting to grow the network. And so for most people at the time, the bicycle was really the only feasible way they had then to travel more than walking distance away from where they lived. And so, yeah, you see bike shops popping up all over the place. And what's interesting is they are called bicycle shops, but they sell a whole array of mobility items that are somewhere between bicycles and eventually motorcycles and automobiles. They're playing with self-powered ones like traditional bicycles versus electric-powered versus gas-powered. There's even evidence of some steam-powered vehicles, and they're all being sold out of the same shops, which is really interesting to see. One thing I found that is interesting is a shop called Ten Voorde Ford dealership, which exists now in the Twin Cities, that they originally were a bike shop, that they're images of their storefront with a whole bunch of bikes, either in boxes or laid out during this time period, 1890s. And then it's during the following 20 years or so that they make the transition just from bicycles to motorcycles to automobiles. And so I think that would have been a case for a lot of the bike shops that existed back then, that they sold a lot of different things that they, at the time, probably wouldn't have thought of as very different in the way that we do now. But then over time, as the industry grew, it sort of consolidated into different power players, especially as they're able to be more mass-produced. And so it's this period of technological fluidity where everyone was really excited about being able to self-power how they moved. And the bicycle was really the beginning of that, but it ushered in a lot of technological creativity.
But even as cycling evolved and new technologies with it, I felt like I was missing one part of the story. What was it like to ride a safety bicycle on the streets of the 1890s?
Imagine riding your bike. It's not a bike that is solid in the way that you would assume your bike is right now, where it can handle any sort of rough terrain. There's no suspension. There's no, a lot of the tires are actually just solid rubber. And so while it's better than wood, you still feel every little jut and bounce. And really any of the roads you'd be riding on outside of right downtown are not only muddy and potted out, but they're ones that when it rains become mud, and deep mud that you get stuck in. And in the summer, they're rutted out from wagon tracks and from horse-drawn vehicles, which are most of what you'd see on those roads. And so in the same way that bicyclists in the city encountered a world that was very much centered around people walking, early streetcars, and then animal-drawn vehicles, in the countryside, that's even more in that way, where you have farmers who are using it really just to get goods from farms to rivers, which would have been where they would distribute them from.
Today, we might think about roads as serving the sole purpose of transportation. But this was not necessarily the case in the late 1800s. Peter says that bicycles became popular at a time when there was a lot of debate over the purpose of a street.
I think what's even more daunting to imagine is that streets really in the early 20th century were not meant for moving transportation through A to B, that they were considered public spaces, where in the same way you'd have parents who would send their kids out to go play in the street. They didn't have playgrounds. That was the place where people were. And so a lot of these pictures that you have of early streets, it is that melee of everything. You've got the horse-drawn vehicles, you've got the streetcars, you've got early cyclists, you have people who are walking, and there are sidewalks in some places, but for the most part, people walked wherever they wanted to, because that process of pushing non-drivers to the edges of the street hadn't happened yet. And a lot of what people were fighting when they were upset about early cyclists and drivers going too fast up the street is that they were trying to monopolize street space for themselves, whereas that at the time would have been considered something that was equally shared between everyone. And so it's this really interesting dynamic that I think the way that all of us interpret streets today is hard to imagine. But when you look at some of the sources back then, early cyclists, early drivers, really in some ways early streetcars were considered nuisances because they disrupted that space that's more like how we'd consider a park today.
One of those nuisances, young male thrill seekers speeding through these public spaces.
They call them scorchers, exactly because they're just kind of blazing through on these paths. And so I've seen articles in the Minneapolis Tribune really kind of talking about like the dangers of scorching, where it's this whole like cultural movement of a speed and a way of moving that is disrupting what's normal and what's typical there. And the people who are the scorchers are not the ones who are out for a nice little Sunday ride. They're the ones who want adventure. But pretty early on, I think that's most people's, if people had an experience with a cyclist, it was probably with that type.
Out of these tensions came something called the Good Roads Movement. It unfolded in local municipalities all across the country starting in the 1870s, in tandem with cycling's popularity. Cyclists were advocating for safer roads and dedicated cycling paths, both in and out of the city.
Everything was just this kind of muddy mess of tracks. There was no central organization at any government level. They were basically maintained by farmers and in lieu of taxes, sort of work agreements. And so cyclists who were organizing these wheelmen's clubs, that's the beginning of what we now call the Good Roads Movement, focusing on developing a nationwide system of roads from cities into the countryside, between cities. There are these amazing maps of groups who are imagining this nationwide network of trails. And a lot of them would start in the urban areas where people lived and then extend out into countryside. But that's really the first impact that you see in the form of infrastructure from cycling.
Here in Minnesota, the Good Roads Movement was robust. The movement went beyond the cities, into rural spaces around the state. Rugged dirt roads in and out of cities caused problems for cyclists and farmers alike, especially as automobiles became more affordable. These efforts eventually resulted in paved rural roads, albeit with less bicycle-specific infrastructure. Meanwhile, the Minnesota Cycle Path Association, a privately funded organization, was able to create 35 miles worth of bike paths in Minneapolis by 1900. To use those paths, cyclists had to purchase a tag for their bike. It cost 50 cents. By the end of that year, about 26,000 tags had been purchased. That's about 15% of Minneapolis's population.
And so early on, they're privately funding these through bicycle tag sales. But by the 1890s, you have Minneapolis and you have St. Paul governments who are administering bicycle tags. They're collecting revenue. They're paving new side paths as part of the park's development and kind of buying especially water-adjacent land. And they're doing all of that. That's something that's across the U.S. and different cities is really unique, and it's one of the main reasons that the Twin Cities still have such a robust park system, because they committed to this idea of public ownership and public maintenance and provision really early, that even after the wheelman groups had traded their bikes in for cars, which started to happen really in the 1900s, pretty soon, that you still have all of these side paths and bicycle paths, even when they weren't used by bicycles, that they stayed under the Parks Department and they were able to be resurrected in a way that couldn't happen in other cities, 50 years later.
This led me to another question. Where did Peter find all this information on how late 1800s citygoers thought about streets and how much traffic was on them?
What I initially used, I found some really cool old count data from Minneapolis that the city engineer's office did. It only goes from 1906 to 1911, and they counted downtown the number of bicycles, automobiles, and then horse-drawn vehicles. And see, the first question when you have accounts for 5 years and then they stop is, why did they stop?
Why? Yeah.
And what's interesting is that they count the number of those vehicles, but then they also count the mass tonnage for each vehicle and then in total. And what it is they weren't actually measuring traffic in the way that we think of today. They were measuring the load that was on roads they were building that really weren't designed for the increasing number of personal mobility vehicles like bicycles. Bicycles aren't so heavy, but cars especially. And so I start with that data.
And you were talking about those surveys. It was clear that those surveys were part of, can the road itself as a piece of infrastructure handle that load, right?
Mm-hmm.
What were these roads made out of as a result in order to carry that load?
Yeah. So the best answer I found, and it's not definitive, but that 1911, when they stopped taking that survey, kind of lines up with when they started using more of an asphalt material, which it's interesting because the word for tarmac actually comes from how they added tar to what before was a very loose gravel material called macadam. And so it's adding tar to macadam to make tarmac. And that's really a result of having bicycles and automobiles because they had smaller tires and they were going faster. And so they could pick up some of this small grain material and, shoot it to the sides of the road. And so the tar actually bound that together and made the streets stronger.
Peter told me that by 1907, Minneapolis's street traffic broke down like so.
24% of the vehicles were bicycles, and something like 6% were automobiles, and then 70% were horse-drawn vehicles.
This does not account for the high rates of streetcar use in the city. By 1920, Minneapolis's ridership was up to something like 220 million trips per year. That type of public transit would not have been accounted for in the surveys of street traffic alone. But the 1920s was also the decade when cars were being mass-produced and became more affordable. The story goes that as Americans bought more cars, bicycling went into decline. But according to Peter, that's not the whole story. Photographs from the era show plenty of cyclists and pedestrians. It's the engineer's data that doesn't. Why the discrepancy?
You realize that the people who are taking these counts, who are trying to measure traffic or measure how streets are used, that they have their own bias they bring to it. They're choosing who to count, who not to count. And a lot of the count, it points to a lot of the count data we have that either doesn't include important users, or it weighs some heavier and some lighter than they should be. And so the photographic evidence is a way to kind of see on those streets, what do they actually look like?
Peter is making an important point here. Historians have to interrogate their sources. He can't take the engineer's data at face value. He needed to look for other pieces of evidence to get the full picture. So if the photos show Minnesotans were still cycling after the biking craze of the 1890s, was it still for leisure, or had things changed?
I think the most important thing to understand is when the transition of the people who are cycling in the 1890s versus the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. And, we've talked about these kind of wealthy, young, especially guys who are biking out into the countryside. But we also see that shift to utility cycling of people who are using it not to go out on a weekend trip, but to get somewhere that they need to go. But what's unique with Minneapolis compared to, other examples is that it's not so much of the home to work trip, the direct A to B. Instead, what you see is people whose job is actually navigating streets, that the earliest photos are of postmen, of police officers, of tradesmen, of telegraph messenger boys, people who aren't just going from one place to another, but that their whole job is mobility, basically. And it kind of points to this non-commuting cycling that is tough to pin down because so much of what we think about transportation is commuting. And that's something that I think is important to this day. But at the time, they undervalued that as well. And so really after the initial movement of building bicycle paths that we've talked about, there really isn't much bicycle infrastructure in the Twin Cities. It's something that, if you take a cursory glance, it looks like bicycles just disappeared. They straggled on for a while, they disappeared, and then magically came back in the 70s. But what we can see is that that disappearance is really just them kind of receding from the purview of the people who are measuring transportation, in the same way of those early counts in the early 1900s, that there is this connective thread that is, I think, unique in some ways globally. It follows a lot of trends of bicycle kind of growth and then fall and stabilization and then some of the regrowth that we see today. But it paints a story that I think gives a better explanation than saying bicycles and bicyclists disappeared and then came back.
The evidence Peter has found shows that biking never disappeared in Minnesota. Minnesotans continued to bike in the decades following the initial craze of the 1890s. By the 1960s, a new era of biking was emerging, hand in hand with the environmental movement. People worried about the damage cars could have on the environment, the destruction of neighborhoods to make way for highways, and the impact breathing in emissions and traffic-related smog could have on people's health. Bicycling was a tangible response to these concerns, especially for cyclists living in dense urban areas where pollution from cars and factories was a huge concern. But how did folks living outside the Twin Cities, in less populated areas with fewer concerns about urban pollution, experience biking? For that, I spoke with Peggy Prowe. She moved to Minnesota in 1966, took a job with Carleton College in Northfield, and soon after started a family. At the time, Northfield's population was between 8 and 10,000. In a smaller, less dense area like this, cycling culture looked a little different than it did 40 miles north in the Twin Cities. For Peggy, biking during those times was, in large part, about commuting and leisure.
Northfield isn't very big, and I built a house a mile from campus, and we never got a second car until the kids were teenagers and needing to learn. We just biked everywhere. Detail, my husband, taught history at Carleton, and he biked to work. I biked to Carleton to teach.
Mm-hmm. And so you say you were just biking to work. Does that mean that you were biking on sidewalks or you were biking on the road? Okay.
The unmarked road. But now they're all marked. It isn't like Minneapolis traffic. But the network of trails in the cities, we used to come up and ride the network of trails up here because they were so far ahead of us.
But as her kids got a bit older, Peggy got them involved too.
My family went hiking in Itasca when my son and daughter were teenagers, and the mosquitoes just about ate us up. And we decided that bicycling was the only way to be in the outdoors in Minnesota. And we had a whole bunch of bikes. It was fun. I'm a physical educator. I'm a nature nut. I want people outside. I want people busy. I have friends here in the co-op who walk around the block with me, and that's a little bit satisfying. My mother was a physical educator until she became a high school counselor, and she was pretty convincing raising the four of us kids.
Starting in 1990, Peggy began serving as a city councilwoman in Northfield.
I'd served on some commissions, and I was really interested in the parks and trails part of the city.
This period marked a transition to yet another era of cycling, one with a focus on sustainability, where people chose to ride bicycles in an effort to be both eco-friendly and healthy. Here's Peter again.
Yeah. So that's something that you see starting to develop in the 90s, but really in the 2000s is where that begins, and it kind of coincides with people moving back to cities. This new urbanism, a lot of redevelopment of the urban land and urban areas that people had left a generation before.
This sustainability era played out differently across Minnesota. Urban areas like the Twin Cities could redevelop and expand their latent cycling infrastructure. But rural areas did not have as much infrastructure to work with. That brings us back to Peggy. By the year 2000, Northfield's population had grown to more than 17,000. There were bicycling enthusiasts, but not too many places to ride. One of the pinnacles of Peggy's time with the city council was the construction of Northfield's Mill Towns Trail in the late 1990s, so named in recognition of the town's long history with flour and grist mills along the Cannon River Valley.
So I helped organize a friends group and helped the city of Northfield build the first 3 miles between Dundas and Northfield in 1998. The Parks and Trails Council of Minnesota was instrumental in buying, with Goodhue County, a piece of land that made the first 3 miles in Goodhue County from Cannon Falls to Billsby Regional Park. In Faribault, MnDOT was reconstructing an intersection between Highway 3 and 21. If they had not put the 2 underpasses in at that point, we wouldn't have a trail. There wouldn't be connections. And those sorts of almost roadblocks came up from time to time.
The trail runs for 6 miles, over the Cannon River, through some woods, behind houses, across a field, over an old rail bed. Its opening was a big deal in the Northfield community. Peggy remembers people showing up to celebrate any time a new part of the trail opened.
When we put the underpasses in Faribault for 3 and 21, there were people walking on that blacktop before it was cool. It was they had just laid it, and people were connecting west and the main part of Faribault. Yeah. I remember the bridge. We had people selling T-shirts and a band playing. Dan Bergeson has brought his brass band for us for each of the events. And when the bridge at Billsby was built, that was such a major connection to the city of Cannon Falls that the DNR really had a huge celebration. We put up a great big tent, and there must have been 200 people that were there to do the ribbon cutting, and it was really fun.
That bridge Peggy mentioned? It's got a pretty cool name.
A mayor, a good friend, named it for me, which is sort of fun. They still call it the Peggy Prowe Bridge, which does impress my son-in-law.
The trail is an ongoing project, evolving and expanding. I had an idea of what cycling advocacy had looked like back in the late 1800s with the Good Roads movement. But what does more contemporary advocacy look like? What is the work of supporting new and existing cycling infrastructure?
So it's working with 6 cities, three counties, federal, state, and local. It's been very interesting. I've gotten to know an awful lot of very nice people who feel committed to public welfare, to helping communities.
At the same time that Peggy was advocating for biking infrastructure in Minnesota's more rural areas, my final guest, José Luis, was building community through cycling in the more urban and densely populated environment of Minneapolis. José Luis's introduction to cycling was a little different than Peggy's.
Growing up really poor and not being able to afford, my parents not being able to afford to purchase a bike for me, where I learned how to steal bikes. You know, I came up in that way that I learned for things that I wanted, I had to establish skills to be able to get the things I wanted. My parents then discovered that I was stealing bikes and I was really good at it. They finally bought me a bike. I would just share all the young people listening to this to not get into bikes by stealing bikes. But it's how I came up through stealing bikes, kind of gave me an opportunity to learn about community organizing. You know, be able to organize people. It gave me a skill of hands-on skills on working on bikes. It really gave me this element of freedom, you know, of exploring further without fear, right? To interrupt the impacts we were experiencing because of poverty at home. It was able to interrupt that aspect and become physical. Just kind of experience nature, experience freedom, and give a pause to the stresses that I would argue white supremacist contexts and elements that existed in pressures in my upbringing, right? And so I was able to kind of disrupt that by getting away from it on a bike. And I grew up with, you know, mostly poor white folks, very diverse, a lot more diverse upbringing than I experienced coming here to Minnesota at my after going to college here. So it was a crew from people from all over the world, Filipinos, Samoans, poor white kids, black kids, that we just grew up riding bikes together. You know, people from all over the world that we use these bikes to kind of interrupt the pressures at home or the stress and frustrations parents would lash out at us because of the pressures of oppression and poverty. Like bikes gave us an opportunity to kind of pause that for a minute and get out into the streets and into the hills and bike paths.
José Luis brought his love of biking and the benefits he saw it could bring to his community here in Minneapolis.
We did it's called Is a Food in the Hood Killing Us tour of South Minneapolis, and the youth kind of walked around and did a survey of all the grocery stores in the community and found outdated food, found a variety of things that were really keeping them healthy, and started to produce solutions. And we shared those solutions to legislators and council folks, anyone that wanted to hear about what their solutions were to environmental issues and food insecurity. And that just kind of span out to become Tamales and Bicicletas. We're looking at Tamales and Bicicletas are looking at sustainable transportation and kind of flipping and or reclaiming our understanding to growing food organically, traditionally, with our neighbors, our community. And so our work with Tamales and Bicicletas, usually I like to say, is that we build community first and we grow and ride bikes last. So we engage our youth in the community on biking, getting out on biking, through connecting them to murals, urban farming, growing food over the winter months through biking. We also, through growing food, we kind of connect with young adults and families on sharing stories of our abuelitos, our tios, our amas, apas that have showed us how to grow food, that maybe identified a plant that was important to them. We kind of do a lot of that lifting in the work that we do. So it was a variety of folks that have come and went and kind of build up where we're at now. So when I say the we, it's a lot of elders, it's folks in the community, it's youth, and it's youth that we've buried, it's youth that we've lost, it's that contributed to the work we continue to do.
José Luis founded Tamales y Bicicletas to support the immigrant community. As of 2021, 15% of the population in Minneapolis was born abroad. I asked José Luis about what the experience has been like for immigrants seeking to get into bicycling.
You could see our communities, they weren't riding the best bikes. They were riding broken bikes at times, but they were on those bikes, right? And so I just started to see that was a trend and had always been a trend. And they would tell me their horrible stories they were having at bike shops. People don't speak el idioma, se ríen de mí cuando traes la bicicleta aquí, o me dicen no te puedo ayudar porque you're not going to pay the full amount. So there was a lot of discrimination or being uncomfortable in a traditional white-led bike culture environment that I was like, okay, let's create our own stuff. And so, we had a bike shop for about 7 years on Lake Street where we fixed bikes. We interrupted the flow and boredom of a lot of youth and younger Latino adults to come learn about how to do bike repair, how to just talk about bikes. And eventually we started to get recommendations from bike shops. I was like, me dijeron que ahí estaban ustedes, voy a venir a visitar y eso. And because of the price and also the language barrier that existed at other bike shops. And so there was a void that we were filling in, not just because of the language, but also the fact that a lot of the bike culture at the time were not able to equip or service immigrant communities or communities that didn't speak English. It was an opportunity that if you work with young people, whether you're painting a mural, working in a bike, or even growing food, you kind of allow a space, a neutral space to process, right? So a broken chain it now becomes a racist teacher. And what tools do I need to deal with that racist teacher or unhealthy relationship? So that broken chain or flat tire becomes that. And so those are the opportunities that I saw naturally working on bikes. And José Luis, este maestro no me quiere. I'm like, so let's talk about the tools you need. Well, let's develop the tools you already have to sharpen them up to be able to respond to that racist teacher or to set some healthy boundaries in that relationship. And so those are the things that I always say that we do bikes last, we build community first, is that was happening. That was happening when working with young people.
Tamales y Bicicletas' work is multifaceted. Beyond bike repair, the group also runs youth bike tours.
We've done a lot of bike tours. We did what we refer to as urban solution to pollution tours. And we would do those on bikes. And one of the things that we would always do is we would start with the solution. So we would start, I don't know if you've been to Zapata Park, this little corner. It's embarrassing. It sucks. That's all we got. But we get there, we start a tour there, and I talk about how Zapata, the community, when it got here as a gift from the state of Morelos, the sister city, that we wanted in Powderhorn Park. And people came out and were really against it and very racist towards our community because of this monument. But we start there as our culture. We start there, there's some murals nearby, and we bike around looking at the murals, going through the community.
And one of the stops on the bike tours? The Tamales y Bicicletas urban farm. José Luis told me it's about more than just growing food.
This is created by our hands, from traditions, from reconnecting traditions, like I mentioned earlier, from our abuelitos or our parents, teaching these things, or reconnecting with a loss that we did not. Maybe you did not receive that from your parents. We are trying to reclaim that. We have folks, young adults, that may or may not bike, but choose to farm with us. We have folks that use bikes as art in our collective or group, and they do bike stuff away. We have neighbors that come by and may not even grow with us. Some of the elders like Maria and Carmen, they come by every once in a while during harvest. They're around when they can, and they connect. They tell stories. They comment on how beautiful those spaces or come hang out. So it's really not just who's growing there, but who is nearby. We always like to say that urban farm spaces are lungs in our city, right? It's a place to breathe, physically to show up and breathe and take a pause in the neighborhood.
José Luis's work with Tamales y Bicicletas and his experience with biking don't seem to fit neatly within the sustainability era that Peter has described. As I'm listening to you talk about all these different initiatives and the way that you're talking about sustainability really sounds different than perhaps traditional Western ideas about sustainability. It feels different what you're doing. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Right. We do it with community. And I think for us, being immigrant communities of color that we work with closely, our presence is resistance. Learning a skill is resistance. Growing food together, loving each other is a form of resistance. And so that's the decolonizing efforts of it in the true sense. And not in theory, not in these big words, but in practice. And at the same time, the work is about centering us in the forefront of climate chaos or in the forefront of environmental racism. The solutions won't come out anywhere else. It will come from people like us that are experiencing these environmental impacts on a day-to-day. And that we don't use code words like environmental justice, climate justice. We're saying, I can't breathe right.
Talking with these three guests made me realize that bicycles and cycling infrastructure have meant many things to the many people living in Minnesota. And that each individual's relationship with biking changes throughout their lives. Here's Peggy and José Luis.
I've had such a sequence of bikes. It started with road bikes, thin tires, and a rack to carry. Well, at one point I was carrying a baby in a seat on the back and a toddler on the seat on the front, and that was pretty exciting. And later, when I really needed help, I had an electric bike that was bright red. That was sort of fun. But it was too powerful. And then I got a tadpole that was a three-wheel electric bike. And I rode that the last 2 years. I started a group of senior bicyclists who were slowpokes. We'd go 10 miles an hour at the most.
That's faster than me. I'm not very good on a bicycle, so I think that's really good.
Pays to practice. But people in their 60s, 70s are still biking in Northfield. I now live in a senior co-op in Minneapolis.
That's something that now resonates with José Luis as well.
Yeah, what's changed is my body. I'm a lot older now, and my knees are not the best sometimes, one of my knees. And so what I find now is walking is been the thing I'm into these days. And I've been exposed to e-bikes. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced that's the thing to go, but I have enjoyed my time on an e-bike.
Each of the three people I spoke with felt a deep, long-standing connection with cycling. Each of them also spoke about the ways they share cycling with their loved ones. Here's Peter again.
I think that what I've most enjoyed about cycling is being able to involve my own son with that. He's 8 years old, and so we go on all sorts of bike adventures. We're lucky to live in a place now where we can get on a bike and we can just travel between cities. We can go on trips like that, but being able to share kind of just the fun part of cycling and the part of it that just reminds you of your childhood, to be able to continue to enjoy that and then pass that on to someone else, I think is what I appreciate the most.
There's a white one that my daughter-in-law is still riding.
Oh, so you passed it on to your daughter-in-law?
Yeah, that's what bikes do. They go to the next fitting person. Yeah. It did a lot of miles.
Yeah, I have three boys, and They love bikes. They like going out. It's not like pulling teeth. It's like, let's go for a bike ride. They were also part of the bike program. And we just had youth of color, immigrant youth, Somali youth, Latino youth come out. We just biked. And it was kind of cool. We ended at a park at the end of the season eating tamales together. There were some youth, immigrant youth, that had never eaten a tamal. They were like, and so my kids and others were showing them how to eat one. And so it was not just biking, it was also food. And it was about learning about other cultures. But yeah, if anything, they are passionate, not only about biking, but just exploring. Dad, when are we going camping? Dad, can we go snowboarding? Dad, can we get out of the city? Dad, can we go do these things, just to be out in nature? I think, if anything, I've kind of exposed them to that being a normal thing for them.
Walking back toward my car, I had a new appreciation for the bicycle path I was walking alongside. It's something that seems modern and contemporary as more cities integrate cycling infrastructure. But after speaking with Peter, I understand that cycling culture's roots in Minnesota go all the way back to the 1870s. This bike path is a legacy decades in the making, the result of advocacy spanning 3 different eras of cycling culture. Talking with Peggy and Jose Luis shined a light on the impact location can have on the experience of cycling. Rural infrastructure and the process of advocating for it looks much different than it does in a more urban space. But across all spaces, cycling's meaning has evolved and widened to include everything from healthy lifestyle to leisure activity to empowerment to connecting with loved ones. What has cycling meant to you? What's your favorite bicycle path? And how have you connected with your community through bicycles? Let us know by sharing a photo on social media with the hashtag #MNUnraveled. You've been listening to Minnesota Unraveled, pulling on the threads of Minnesota history. I'm your host, Dr. Chantel Rodríguez. You can find more information on this episode, including transcripts, bibliographic resources, and Minopedia articles at our website, mnhs.org/unraveled. Minnesota Unraveled is produced by the Minnesota Historical Society in partnership with Pod People. Special thanks to our production team, Rebecca Chasson, Angela Yee, and Brett Baldwin. And sound design and editing by Erica Wong. Lead research by me, Dr. Chantel Rodríguez. Our theme music is Careless Wanderer by Arthur Benson. Funding for Minnesota Unraveled is provided by the state of Minnesota, the legacy amendment through the vote of Minnesotans on November 4th, 2008, and our generous donors and members. Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay curious, and remember, the tapestries of history are all around you, just waiting to be unraveled. Thanks for listening to Minnesota Unraveled. We appreciate your feedback and would love to hear your thoughts. Please fill out the survey at mnhs.info/podcast survey.